Hey everybody, I hope you're having an amazing day today, and if you're not, I hope you're taking steps and you're in action regardless. Today is December 10th, which is internationally recognized as World Human Rights Day. And I'm making a point of bringing that up today because if you've been listening to any of the breaking news on NPR or in the New York Times or whatever, you're hearing a lot about the recent CIA information that has come out about our torture techniques in the Middle East and Guantanamo, like how we've been torturing people and whether or not these methods are effective. There's a lot of talking heads debating this information back and forth. So I want to put in my 2 cents, not simply as someone with an opinion, but someone who has an understanding of the neuroscience and psychology of stress. Not that I'm an expert in this field, but I do a lot of research, and this is what the experts are saying, all right? Torture is a very extreme form of stress, either physical or psychological or both. And it's been shown in numerous studies that really, really potent stressors impair memory. Not just memory storage, but memory recall. And that's even a misnomer, memory recall. We don't actually recall our memories. It's not as if they're stored on a hard drive and we just load them like you would on a computer. We actually recreate them each time we bring them into our conscious mind. So there is a cognitive process that takes place when you're bringing a memory into your present. So you're not actually recalling it, you're reconstructing it. And as you do so, you actually change it a little bit each time. So what actually happened and the words that come out of your mouth or the images that you have in your mind of that experience are going to differ over time. And the more you recall it, the more reconstructive anomalies you will place into that memory. And eventually it could look very, very different than what actually happened. Okay, that's kind of how memory works as far as recall goes. You reconstruct. But more importantly, stress significantly impairs our ability to do this because it is a cognitive process. And when we are under stress, our cognitive brain, the prefrontal cortex, is down-regulated, which means it's not getting a lot of blood, it's not getting a lot of glucose, and it's not getting a lot of oxygen. Why? Because stress in the body physiologically equals fight, flight, or freeze. And that experience is not one that you can afford to engage in processes that not only demand a lot of fuel, like thinking. Thinking demands a lot of fuel, but secondly, thinking is slow. If you're driving down the road and it's snowy like it is outside right now, and a car cuts you off or starts, 360ing in front of you, you better hit on the brakes instantly. You don't have time to think about it. You don't have time to think about what kind of car it is or which direction it's spinning in or what the driver is, male, female, whatever. You need to hit the brakes and react immediately before you can consciously think. So the moment that we get an extreme stressor like that, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, gets downregulated, deprived of blood, deprived of glucose, deprived of oxygen, so that other parts of the brain can take over and be dominant and save your butt, hopefully. All right? Part of fight, flight, or freeze is that most of the blood goes into the muscles so that the muscles are at the ready so that you can run or fight. All right? So the brain, at least the forebrain, the front part of your brain, is getting less blood, and the hindbrain, the more primitive back part of your brain, is getting more blood. So you're more reactive and more physically able to do things in those moments. So recalling memory being a cognitive process using both the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, those are the 2 parts of the brain that are largely involved in that, they're not getting the blood required to really do a good job. Okay? And if somebody is chronically stressed for a long period of time, and if you've been detained in Guantanamo or wherever else for long periods, and they're torturing you daily and just keeping you in a prison cell or forcing you to stand up, chaining you to the wall, making you stand up for days at a time, that is massively, chronically stressful. So the ability for these people to recall or reconstruct memories is minimal. The accuracy of their recall is going to be pretty low. And they'll just make up details, not even consciously. It's not like they're trying to make up details. Their brain is just trying to fill in the gaps, which is what your brain does when you remember anyways, when you recall these things. You're rebuilding them. Your brain extrapolates. It's like, okay, I think this happened and I think that happened, so let's put this thing in the middle to make it sound cohesive. And you're not consciously doing that. This is an unconscious process that takes place to make our thoughts and memories seem seamless when they're in fact not. So the more stress someone is under, the more difficulty they will have recalling memories accurately, because the parts of the brain necessary to do that are not getting the fuel or the blood to do so. Okay? And this isn't just for people that are being tortured. It's also for people that are dealing with stress on a daily basis in their lives, either at work or in traffic or in a relationship or financially, or they're dealing with some chronic illness. Those stressors will do the same thing if they are chronic. Now, a short-term, moderate stress actually improves your ability to store memories. We store them in the prefrontal cortex. So you can think of the prefrontal cortex as the hard drive, in a sense. That's where they're stored. They're stored up here. But the software that allows us to utilize or access those memories is in our hippocampus. So they get stored in the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus is the software that does the memory processing. When we're under a moderate amount of stress, we're really good at remembering things. The more emotionally engaging that moment is, the more likely we are to remember it to a point. If it's too stressful, then our ability becomes impaired. But if it's a moderate stressor, we actually are better at storing those memories. All right? So there's a fine line. A moderate amount of stress, good for memory storage, good for memory recall, but too much stress and suddenly the whole thing falls apart. And students experience this when they're cramming for a test. If you try to lump it all up in the last minute and just cram and pull some all-nighters before the exam, chances are you're not going to store it and you're not going to recall it because of the amount of stress that you're experiencing. But more importantly, here's another thing. You can actually do long-term damage to the brain in these chronically stressed out situations. And this is something that I personally have experienced. I had memory issues due to decades of depression. And one of the things that happens in a chronically depressed state is that you have lots of circulating cortisol in your system. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's part of a class of hormones called glucocorticosteroids. And these guys are really important when you're in danger to help you get out, but for long periods of time, they actually do a lot of damage. Because when there is cortisol present in your bloodstream, in the brain, glucose and oxygen are decreased. And it's really important to have glucose and oxygen going to this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, because the neurons that occur there are very, very highly excitatory. We get this in other parts of the brain as well, highly excitatory neurons. But in these two particular areas, because they're affected so profoundly by stress, this can be problematic because what excites a neuron is a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And glutamate is essentially just an amino acid. The body doesn't have to do anything to it to turn it into a neurotransmitter. It actually uses the amino acid because this is a really important process, so it doesn't have time to waste turning glutamate into something else. So it's like, let's just use glutamate. That's the fastest way to get this thing done. So glutamate is the neurotransmitter that really gets your neurons amped up, fired, excited, and when they're excited, you can do things. You can think, you can memorize, you can respond, you can write poetry. All right? It's glutamate that allows for that to happen. But too much glutamate can over-excite the neuron and actually kill it. It can kill the brain cell, kill the neuron, which is why you might have heard of excitotoxins. There are a lot of people that believe that monosodium glutamate, MSG, it's a glutamate, This is an excitotoxin. Or aspartate, which is similar to glutamate, is also an excitotoxin. And aspartate sounds a lot like aspartame because it is a synthetic version of aspartate. So too much glutamate or aspartate or a synthetic version of those two can overexcite these neurons to death, and then you get long-term damage in the brain, which can lead to memory loss, which is something that I'm dealing with as I get older. I can't remember a lot of things. It's very hard for me to store things in memory unless I'm really, really excited. If I'm super pumped about something, I can still store it. But if I'm not super pumped, man, it's gone. It just vanishes. So most of the things I do throughout my day, I can't remember what I did 15 minutes ago. Yesterday, gone, unless it was really, really cool. So how this happens, oxygen and glucose are basically the fuels. They're what allow these neurons to work at full capacity, and they're what allow these neurons to regulate how much glutamate is being used. So when you're under stress and you have less glucose and less oxygen, you have less fuel for these neurons to regulate glutamate. So glutamate can get out of control because it's in our diet in large amount. Not just talking about MSG, but glutamate is in many, many, many foods. In fact, there are now links to autism and glutamate in food. And parents are finding that if they can reduce the glutamate that a child consumes, many of their autistic symptoms go away. So, stress reduces glucose, reduces oxygen, allows glutamate to be unregulated, unchecked, to get out of control, and it starts doing some damage. Which is also why you can get brain damage from having a stroke or a heart attack. If you've had a heart attack and your brain isn't getting enough oxygen or glucose for even 3 to 5 minutes, brain cells start to die because glutamate gets out of control and it starts exciting the neurons to death. So this is why people with strokes get brain damage, and people with heart attacks can get brain damage because of the dysregulation of glutamate. And this also happens when you're under stress. Not to the same degree, but it happens to a smaller degree, and over a long period of time, you can do some damage. So, getting back to my point, torturing people and expecting them to recall accurate details is nonsense. Yeah, people are going to say, okay, I'll tell you. But is their stress now suddenly gone because they've agreed to tell? Okay, we're not going to cut your eyelids off anymore. So now suddenly you're going to be able to recall these things? No, that stress is chronic now. You've been tripped. They don't torture you and then 5 minutes later you feel good again. When you've been tortured, this can last for the rest of your life. This stress can be a permanent fixture in someone's life after going through an experience like that. If you've ever been in a really, really traumatic experience, you know this. You know how long that can stay with you. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Stress just doesn't go away after really, really traumatic events. So expecting someone to recall really accurate details after torturing them? Come on. Do a little research. And it's just totally inhumane and unacceptable. And I do not support it in any way, shape, or form. So I hope that was of some value to you. I just had to throw my 2 cents in there because I hear these talking heads and politicians just going back and forth, and nobody's really talking about the neurochemistry or neurobiology of these processes, what happens under stress. Scientists know this, a lot of university professors know this, a lot of doctors know this, but the politicians, nobody's talking about it. All right? And it's important that you know it. For your own benefit too, because this is why you need to reduce the levels of stress in your life, because it's toxic and damaging. Okay? All right. I love you. Bye.